are going to be very worthwhile indeed. Over to you.
Great. Look, thanks very much for that, Lord McConnell, and a huge thanks as well to the British Council for supporting this work. I'd probably say that some of the things that you'll hear from me today will be new. Some of them will be not so new, but fundamentally the message that I want to convey is that time is up. It's a now or never when it comes to fragile and conflict affected states and the SDGs. And I hope that will be one of the main takeaways from my presentation today. But the place to start is really, what is the state of play? And the core thesis of our report is that we really do need to hit the reset button on the 2030 agenda, and that this was the case even prior to the onset of COVID. Now, if you look at the stats, we've got 50% of people living in extreme poverty are based in fragile and conflict affected states. And this is expected to rise to about 80% by 2030. So in essence, delivering aid in conflict contexts is the new normal. But as Lord McConnell said, we are seeing this mirroring of the experience of the Millennium Development Goals when it comes to fragile and conflict affected states. Now, there's this big mantra out there around leave no one behind when it comes to the SDGs, but we seem to be doing exactly that when it comes to these fragile and conflict affected states. So you can read our report where we provide some more detail around this, but to give you one headline figure, ODI reports that around 82% of fragile countries are off track to meet the SDG targets. 5 years in, history is repeating. And look, let's not kid ourselves. Some SDGs are already out of reach for some countries like Yemen, for example. Even if the war ended tomorrow, recovery will be generational. So we really need, I think, a bit of a reality check. But how do we actually get here? I think up front, the world, the changes in the global context are making it significantly harder. So despite that economic downturn we saw in 2008, the MDGs were really driven forward by a lot of economic progress in places like India and China, whereas the fragile states we're talking about right now are starting from a significantly lower base. The MDGs were also able to, I guess you could say, hitch a ride on the relative peacefulness of that period as well. And so by contrast, violent conflicts have actually surged globally by 2/3 in the last decade. That is a significant uptick. And then Christine and Lord McConnell mentioned those other dimensions. We've got a retreat from multilateralism. We've got climate change materializing into violent conflict on the ground. We've got deepening global inequality, changing patterns of migration and displacement that we haven't really seen since World War II. And in the face of these enormous global trends, SDG is really not cutting it. It's in some ways it's failing. Now, the UN Secretary General, when he did his report last year on the SDGs, said that there was actually really limited evidence of progress on SDG 16. And in fact, we're actually going backwards on some of the indicators, such as homicide rates, assassination of human rights defenders, and so on. So what's gone wrong with this goal that was intended to avoid exactly the sort of scenario that we find ourselves in right now? I think there are a number of reasons for that. The first is that in some ways SDG 16 was and is a victim of UN member state politics. Now, during the negotiation, there was a lot of resistance to SDG 16, and particularly connecting peace building to it. And it's the usual story: concerns about sovereignty, concerns about interventions in domestic affairs, and so on. Something that's sort of unique to the UN system. But as a result, peace building, which really cuts to the heart of what we're trying to achieve with SDG 16, was sidelined, and this is really problematic because we know that a peace building framework is essential for progress in fragile and conflict affected states. So this approach that takes the contextual needs, that takes the root causes as a starting point, for peace and development is essentially missing in action in the face of a lot of sort of technical targets. And I feel as a result, the way that peace is framed within SDG 16, sometimes not exclusively, but sometimes leans towards really the absence of violence rather than building or cultivating that positive, sustainable peace. Part of it is also selective implementation of SDG 16, and this reflects that politics that I was talking about. So various member states have been doing voluntary national reviews, some clearly trying to do the right thing. They are really on board with the spirit of SDG 16 and indeed incorporating peace across the other SDGs. Timor-Leste is one of those. But we see a very different picture with other countries. Some of them just fail to translate very positive rhetoric into policy action. And we sort of see that, and it's highlighted in the report in relation to Afghanistan. Other countries just completely ignore it, as was the case with Pakistan's voluntary national review. And they actually submitted their review in the year that SDG 16 was given special consideration by the high-level political forum. And then you've got states who, I guess you could say, cherry-pick targets. So hopefully we'll hear a bit more about Nigeria later on. But if you look at their voluntary national review and the SDG actions they chose to focus in on, they're heavily skewed towards building military and security force capability. And that really stems from that sub-target in SDG 16 on counterterrorism and crime. I think one of the key issues that the report highlights, though, is that the SDG architecture really leans towards a much more technocratic, very much a siloed approach. And in essence, I think SDG 16, peace, has essentially been delegated to SDG 16. So all of those other SDGs can just get on with their job. SDG 16 will take care of peace. And that's not the way that it works. Both the UN and World Bank have made crystal clear in their Pathways to Peace report that there is no organic or natural correlation between more development and more peace, unless you actually adapt that assistance to achieve that goal. So all SDG interventions do need to be increasingly designed with that peace outcome in mind, but it is not happening at scale. The paper argues that this is actually a reflection of the international aid architecture. So the problem runs deep, and development institutions are largely organized into sectors with specific disciplines, with sort of a linear approach to problem solving. And while specialization is a good thing, we need experts, it makes that sort of acting across sectors quite difficult. And the supposed solution to a more integrated approach of conflict sensitivity, if you speak to a peace builder, you'll eventually end up talking about conflict sensitivity, which is make sure your interventions don't make things worse in a conflict context, and make sure they also contribute to aspects which make society resilient to conflict. This has really been taken from a very technical perspective. And one of the most interesting things about the report from my perspective as a peace builder is it says peace builders have essentially undersold the level of transformation required to actually apply a conflict sensitive approach in aid in fragile and conflict affected states. There also remains a real underinvestment in peace building itself. So the OECD did some analysis in the first year of the SDGs, noted that funding was, as in sort of the MDGs era as well, skewed towards basic services and infrastructure rather than being targeted towards those things which represent root causes of conflict. And the final challenge, I think, is that we want the SDGs to succeed. Now, in the period of the MDGs, this meant that assistance was actually skewed towards those states who were going to give the biggest return on investment. And this left the rather unfortunately named group of countries called aid orphans. And what is really disturbing is this pattern is happening again. We are seeing aid orphans emerge in that sort of fragile and conflict affected space or category. And then came COVID. COVID will massively compound the issues of conflict-affected states and regions. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this in many other seminars before, eroding already weak trust in governments, amplifying divisive narratives, upswinging misinformation, your violent armed groups using it to recruit, to radicalize. You've got authoritarian inclined regimes using an opportunity to crack down on political opponents. And then we've got this huge economic shock. And I found it fascinating to discover that sub-Saharan Africa has entered its first recession in 25 years as a consequence. While the World Bank is saying that COVID is likely to push, upwards of 50 million people back into poverty. I think one of the other probably disappointing aspects of the COVID response has been that we didn't seem to learn from Ebola. We haven't applied that conflict-sensitive approach, which would help overcome challenges like, I don't trust my government, keep the medical workers away, or these NGO workers are actually spreading the disease, or access-related issues, things that could be fundamentally addressed by a conflict-sensitive peace-building related approach. But I was speaking to a bilateral donor about probably a month or two ago. It was their conflict team, and it was a really interesting conversation because they said, we've just not seen the step change in delivery that we have expected. I mean, we've been talking about conflict sensitivity for a decade. We have policies, we have a certain level of awareness within our institution, but when it came to the crunch, institutionally, we went back to old behaviours. And so I think that's been, something that has really stood out in terms of the response so far. But what can we actually do about this? What is going to give us the best possible chance to see gains around the SDGs in fragile and conflict-affected states? I think we have to start with accepting the new reality. Like when it comes to the climate crisis, business as usual is not going to work. We can't rely on the same sources of energy. We can't drive the same cars. Now, the change in the aid environment is equally dramatic, and it calls for a much more transformative approach. I think fundamentally, a course correction will mean applying a peace-building framework as the principal framework for donor agency, SDG, and COVID interventions in fragile states. So whether it's health, education, infrastructure, it's all designed in some way to contribute to peace while delivering on the core mandate of that SDG. I think donors can also play a really important role in encouraging development partners to integrate SDG 16 and peace building across all SDG sectors, and really have some frank and honest conversations about where cherry picking is actually going on and what that might mean for that relationship. I think it's important to recognize peace builders have a responsibility too. Integrating SDG 16 into health, into education, and so on is not easy. And so we need to make it easy. We need to ensure that people working across the full spectrum of SDGs have the knowledge and understanding to be able to do this. So it's reinforcing their fundamental, core driving objectives and priorities while also delivering for peace. There's also a need to really back civil society in these countries that we're working in to hold the government accountable, both in terms of the COVID response and peace, but also in terms of SDG 16 and the broader SDGs as well. And it's often in these particular contexts where civil society is latent or emerging, particularly those focused on peace, and they need the greatest support. I guess probably one final thing is diplomats. When we talk about SDGs, we often just get focused on development agencies, whereas technical aid interventions are unlikely to have an impact on political exclusion in really polarized societies, or where governments have a vested interest in the status quo. So I think it's time for our diplomats to step up as well. So I guess to conclude, the reality is that without strong leadership from the ministerial level down, the prospects of change and really turning this around are not high. That inertia of the SDGs process and the structural obstacles to achieving it means that we've run out of time for incremental change. So as promised, my final message is that it's now or never.
In the words of Elvis Presley, now or never. And thank you very much, Julian, for that summary of the report, some thoughts on the way forward and how significant our change of approach has to be, not just to deliver on the SDGs, of course, but to make an impact on people's lives, which is what that's all about. We have two additional members of the panel today who are going to reflect on what Julian has said, what the report says, and add to our discussion. So I want to bring both of them in now by asking them a couple of questions each, and then I can open up to questions from the participants. Please feel free to put your question in the chat box, and I'll try and take as many as possible. The first panelist is Sam Rizk, and Sam is currently head of conflict prevention, peace building and responsive institutions at the United Nations Development Programme. We've had both Helen Clark and Akim Steiner, heads of the UNDP, speak to our group in the past, and Sam heads up the Conflict Prevention, Peace Building, Responsive Institutions Department. And he previously worked in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan, and has therefore a lot of practical experience on the ground, as well as now leadership experience in New York on these critical issues. And I wanted to start by asking you, Sam, do you think history is repeating itself here? Are we going to see fragile states left behind? Or is there anything positive that we can look to that's happening on the ground or in New York that might make us think that there is hope?
Thanks so much, Lord McConnell. Thanks, colleagues. It's really difficult to go after Julian because he mentioned a lot of background that I would have said. So I think that cuts a lot of background out too, including what's being done. But let me share the following before I forget and then run out of time. Whatever I say will be related to three key messages around what to do now in relation to peace and peace building, certainly in the COVID context and the SDGs context, and the decade of action. We have about 10 years to go, maybe 9 years to go until we get this. The three key points will always end up being about collaboration and partnership as the key to moving the needle in fragile and conflict contexts. The second message is coherence in analysis and support and programming, especially from the analysis to the programming. And then thirdly is to basically continue to redouble our efforts on prevention and peace building. And that's where I come to what my biggest takeaway from the Peace is the Cure report is, which is we cannot take our foot off the gas. We have a tendency to do that whenever a big shock happens. And I think what the report is saying that despite everything, we just need to press ahead with the peace building agenda, sustaining peace agenda. And I think there are a number of ways that we can do this. Are we at risk, particularly in fragile contexts? I think, frankly, it's gone beyond identifiable fragile contexts at this point. The 50+ fragile contexts that come out in the States of Fragility report that are clearly identifiable. Clearly, most of those are off track for SDGs. But think about this, over the last 2 or 3 years, social protest movements have been happening in a lot of places, well beyond 50 countries. Maybe about half of the world has experienced these for political reasons, for socioeconomic reasons, etc. And all of that has just become exacerbated because of COVID, and then the ability of particular states to manipulate that, to muzzle voices, to limit space, civic space, to trample on human rights even more, to consolidate power. I think that's happening more and more. So the sense of crisis around fragile settings is absolutely clear. Now I think we have to worry about everybody else. Countries that were not identifiable as fragile are starting to look very fragile these days as well. And that's because we often thought that of the category of fragility as folks that have had, endemic problems, they come from, 20 or 30 years worth of autocratic rule, and they have a civil war or a legacy of war, and maybe now they're stabilizing, so we keep them on watch. But what about everybody else, especially countries that end up being one hurricane away, one social protest away, one election away from fragility, from vulnerability, etc. And that's where I'll come a little bit more about what do we envision as a peaceful community? And I think Christine said this well earlier. What does a peaceful community or country look like? My question is, what does a resilient individual or community or state actually look like when we look at it? Our particular approach has been, all of the peace building work that we do from top to bottom, from the Security Council resolutions to the peacekeeping, peace building missions, political missions, and down to individual leaders and peace builders working at the grassroots level. That I think is all great. There's been this missing part that intricately links to SDG 16, which is prevention through institutions, through stronger institutions, resilience through stronger institutions. And that I think becomes the key. That becomes the key issue, and that I think is what was undermined completely by COVID. COVID undermined people, communities, and institutions, let alone states as well. And the link to that, also the multidimensional link. How do you get a pandemic coming out of a particular situation, health, etc., but then all services become disrupted, education, health, infrastructure, social protection, etc. And then a worsening situation if you're already vulnerable in particular contexts because of a conflict or a history or an election or different identities in the countries competing or different ethnicities, all of that. And that, I think, is where we have underappreciated the sense of risk and risk management and risk mitigation. That's what we're trying to figure out now, and that's what we're trying to do more of as well. Can we do better to pre-identify risk in particular countries that is multidimensional, that has aspects of it that are around the individual being compromised, the community being compromised, and the state institutions being compromised? How can we spot it early and therefore act early? And these are lessons from Syria and others. Acting early remains an issue. Acting at scale remains an issue, and thinking and acting as if we are doing something for the long-term issue. Not to criticize the humanitarian mentality, because it's absolutely critical and clear and is timely. But I think we talk a lot about the HDP nexus, humanitarian development, peace. I think we are not there yet. I think the global frames are there. I think in 2016, when everybody went to Istanbul and spoke about and agreed to the grand bargain and agreed to thinking about collective outcomes and agreed to a stronger link between humanitarian development and peace actors. I think a lot of that is still great rhetoric. And I think when the crisis hits, we are still in sequential mode. In sequential as in, oh, we got to do something real quick now, so a humanitarian plan for the next 6 months. Governance has no space in that. Institutions has no space in that. Life-saving and protection, and then resilience, and then development actors. We need help from the donor community, from the partner community, to break down these silos in capitals, just like in many cases we have tried to break down the silos through humanitarian plans now that are actually overcome the sequence of you do life-saving, then eventually you get after some time to a recovery mode. Into most of humanitarian plans now, if you look at them, they're huge, they're big, but they also talk about the same thing. Life-saving, protection, and resilience. These are 3 pillars that are appearing simultaneously in the same plan, not funded in the same level, at the same level, not prioritized in the same level. But I think that's an opportunity to do more. And this is where development actors, I think, have a particular voice in the humanitarian and recovery sphere to do more. But I think in the SDG sphere is to just avoid and continue to go ahead with this non-sequential work. So we are concerned about fragility, but beyond. What can we do in a lot of other countries that may become fragile as well? What can we do? I think the focus definitely is on prevention through institutions, stronger institutions that do not fail, that can prevail in the midst of particular shock. And this is a shock to systems, it's a shock to individuals, and that can recover better. I think it is imperative that in the way we partner, in the way we support, that there is more development support beyond funding, but advocacy and capacity, I think, is absolutely critical as well. Let me end by a couple of things. Conflict sensitivity has been around for quite a long time, and in the interest of just making sure that it sticks around, soon there will be another guidance note on conflict sensitivity and sustaining peace coming out of the UN system that we led with the Peace Building Support Office. We accelerated its finalization because of COVID, because of particular contexts where folks are saying, okay, what do I do now? Multidimensional risks, multidimensional problems, and I've got a conflict background. How do I do things better? And that's where I say the link between analysis and programming does need to be better. And I hope that our donor partners, who we often call, actual, technical partners now, because the discussions that we have with them are more of a technical nature, not just on money, really understand and appreciate the urgency sometimes of the flexibility of funding and support. So I think there is an opportunity to do quite a bit more on conflict sensitivity by linking the analysis to the programming part. On partnerships, yes, in UNDP, a natural partner is often a government or a national authority, etc. But that's never been exclusive. I think our ability to support resilient institutions through prevention is clear, but I think our ability at the same time to be able to work with civil society organizations has always been clear, especially in contexts where there is little capacity, where NGOs can get the work done. And in that sense, I think, just to circle back to the first message, COVID has provided, I think, an opportunity for us to basically check how we respond in situations of high risk and multidimensional crises. And I think we should not be taking our foot off the gas now for a number of contexts, not just fragile and conflict settings. Maybe I'll stop here. Happy to come back with any questions or comments as needed. Over.
Thank you, Sam, for that overview, not only of the current situation, but of what UNDP are strategically trying to do to further improve the work of the different agencies. I'm going to jump now to Wangari Wanjau, who's joining us from Abuja in Nigeria. Wangari worked in other parts of the world previously, including Southeast Asia, but more recently worked in Northeast Nigeria. And I'm always struck by the fact that the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, who's responsible for the SDGs across the UN, originally went to school in Northeast Nigeria and knows the area very well, and therefore has a very deep connection with the problems facing that part of the country. And Wangari's recently taken over as Nigeria Country Director of International Alert. And Wangari, I wanted to start by asking you if you see in Nigeria an integration of peace building activity with other forms of development activity, and have the SDGs helped to further integrate that connection between peace building and development in Northeast Nigeria and elsewhere too?
So thank you so much. I'll start also by saying that we have to change now, because we do not see as much impact or as much progress as we did visioned at this point, considering all the effort and time and support that has gone in. We do not see that being reflected. As Samuel has rightfully stated, we still are stuck in the silos where we still deal with humanitarian, then we go to resilience, then we go humanitarian recovery to resilience. Unfortunately, as we see with a lot of the fragile states, it's in the last decade, these are becoming protracted. Across the world, the responses we are responding to are all protracted. So we do have resources being channeled to different issues. And that's exactly what's happening to Nigeria, where you have, yes, there's conscious efforts. Yes, we are progressive in terms of, we are now engaging in conflict analysis, in gender sensitive approaches, in peace building conversations, but those are not translating to actual impacts in the programming. The analysis are being done, beautiful documentations is being released, participation, collaboration, 100% improvement. We have local faces and local organizations part of the narrative, but the actual impact that to be realized is not happening because it goes back to the same challenges. Do we have the institutions to support this? Do we have the resources to actually catalyze those and influence those changes? Right? We still are focused on saving the life. We are still focused on ensuring the person survives. We are still focused on ensuring the person is protected, but we are not talking to each other to ensure that beyond today, what happens? In 10 years' time, what will happen? We are dealing with a generation. We have children who have been born in this conflict, 10 years, who don't know anything else. Are we tackling that? I see lots has been done in terms of how do the culture, social cohesion issues coming in, but those are not filtering into the response. And as the report says, we do need to be more active. We did need to push ourselves more and ensure that the SDG conversation influences those decisions. Yes, we have to appreciate that the government structures are there now, comparatively to 3 or 4 years ago, but they keep changing. You have new commissions being initiated every day. You have, when we start talking about gender and we see that gender is the issue of the day, then we get a new commission to deal with that. When we start talking about peace building or conflicts issues, then we put in a new commission into that. And eventually you're seated in a room with 10 different commissions with the same agenda, but different approaches, and struggling for the same minimal resources and support. So it ends up, and what do we do as humanitarian, as people trying to respond? Everybody backs up to the traditional of ensuring that that person is safe. So all the resources will eventually end up going back to the humanitarian response, negating all the beautiful assessments or analyses that have been done.
My apologies, I was muted. Thank you very much, Wangari. I was struck by, in the report, obviously, Nigeria is used as an example, and there's reference to the voluntary national review that Nigeria presented to the United Nations, which does address Goal 16 and does mention Goal 16, but has some gaps that have been identified in the report. Do you think in Nigeria, government and institutions have learned anything from that process and perhaps widened their approach and taken a wider lens to all this?
I do think that the Nigerian government learned. We do see a stronger participation and stronger interaction between the planning, especially with the planning processes. There is a lot of learnings from the gaps that we foresaw, but the issues come in that there's selective learning. Let me use that terminology. It's reflected in the things that we are already doing better. Those go in and we can see progress around it, but in issues that we are not doing well or issues that really need to be addressed, that we don't see any assets. So for example, we do see in the SDGs and the review that they did, there was of course a lot of time that took in to go into the SDG 16, but the issues around building the institutions, as Julian mentioned, all the resources are being channeled into the military. So we still have a large chunk of the budget going into the military. And with the COVID situation, we realized that gap. We have not had any budget changes since 2016 to the health sector. Yet we have seen increments in the budgets for the last 5 years in the military, which has resulted in 30 out of the 36 states having a military deployment. So the institutions, yes, that are being prioritized are not the institutions that are needed to support the SDGs. If you have the military as a de facto police in areas that you're looking at solving conflict and building structures that the community owns and the community can go into, that it negates everything that you're talking about. When you're looking, when we do, for example, with the SDGs around the gender issues, yes, they've established commissions. Yes, they've included women into voices in a lot of issues that are happening, but where is the funding that goes into this to support that? We have beautiful experiences of women being mediators in so many of the conflicts across the country, but that's where it ends. To support them to move the next level, nobody's investing in that, because that will, of course, challenge the status quo. And yes, we do have investments we do so much planning these days, which is very positive. They include everybody. We take 3 months to plan for 1 year or for 6 years, but the gist of those analyses and those conversations all end up packed somewhere, while the key ones that tick a box are what we see being fronted out to the communities, and also for political gain, and yet not solving the actual, as a peace builder would say, not the actual root causes that would change or catalyze the change or transformative impact that we require in Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Wangari. Really interesting analysis on the ground there in Nigeria. Julian, just to come back to you briefly, having heard those contributions from Wangari and Sam, what can we be doing here in the UK on this more? We've got a new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, merging the old Foreign Office and DFID. We've got a government, that obviously at the moment is dominated by Brexit and by COVID, but does have 5 years to govern, and therefore we've got a bit of time to work on them, what they do with this new department. What should we as parliamentarians and the wider civil society here in the UK, what should we be looking to suggest, demand, or whatever from the new FCDO to get a better contribution from the UK towards these objectives?
Great, thanks very much for that. I'd probably start by saying that, historically the UK has been a leader on conflict policy thinking. Now, it might need a bit of an update, but that's something that I think this government really needs to invest in and sustain. I think others are starting to pull out ahead, but UK needs to reclaim that space. I think it can do that in a number of different ways. The first is, I think, empowering the people who are responsible for driving forward this agenda internally. Now, often influence, power within institutions and ministries is where the money is, which is your country teams, which is the humanitarian teams. However, it hasn't to date driven the aid program towards a point where peace is getting integrated across the board. And so I think correcting that, situating it at the crossroads of sort of policy and programming to ensure quality, but also shaping that strategy which drives across the board how we operate in conflict-affected contexts is really key. I think also going from rhetoric to action on investing in root causes. So the previous SDSR, for example, it spoke about root causes, but where was the follow-through on that? So I think the integrated review, it'll be really interesting to see where that lands on that particular issue. The Americans, for example, are putting their money where their mouth is. The Republicans and the Democrats got together. They passed something called the Global Fragility Act, which is investing in 10 countries over 10 years in terms of dealing with root causes. So I think that sort of creative thinking is important. And And I think also getting much better at measuring the UK's peace impact. That's really important for parliamentary oversight. It's really important for accountability when it comes to civil society, but it's also, it places the FCDO in a powerful position. If it's looking at it from a cross-government perspective, ensuring that the UK is on track against a set of indicators and milestones to show what our contribution to peace and security in the world is, I think is a very powerful tool. So for me, they're the sort of the key areas that I think it'd be worth focusing on. And I guess as one final point, even if development is not your thing, just from purely a value for money perspective, if you've got all of those SDGs, all those investments working for peace, then that is really going to have a multiplier effect. If we don't do that in a time of constrained resources, then we're going to run into trouble.
Great. Thank you very much, Julian. That's really helpful. We've got a few minutes left, and there's one specific question that has been asked in the chat, and that was from Emmy Phillips-Ocott. It was about the impact of domestic violence and the potential for Goal 16 and Goal 16 related development to help combat domestic violence. She has highlighted in the chat the specific issue of teenage pregnancies during lockdown in northern Uganda. I am certainly aware of this being a significant problem elsewhere too, with those pregnant girls being denied the opportunity to go back to school at the end of lockdown. So let's take that issue and maybe focus on it for the last few minutes. Sam, the situation of girls generally in lockdown, let's take that as a general issue, both about domestic violence and about the pressure they're under in sexualized environments, to the wider opportunities that they might struggle to have as a result of the economic downturn and lockdown, which always end up in affecting girls and women more than men and boys.
Thanks very much. I'll mention something very quickly on this and then go back to the role of the UK as well. I mean, what COVID has presented us with basically is a cascading problem, a problem that starts as a global pandemic, but touches every individual, particularly vulnerable individuals and communities. In many cases, it's women, it's girls, it's female-headed households in particular contexts. And I think that's the thing that we really need to appreciate when thinking about how to support these individuals and communities from a multidimensional perspective. The most important thing that I think we have been discussing in the context, among the most important things that we have been discussing in the context of COVID recently, is the impact on mental health and psychosocial support for particularly vulnerable communities, men, women, girls, the elderly, marginalized minorities, etc., all of which have gotten to the point where they have become among the forgotten. Figuring out how to relink them to the development agenda, to the post-COVID recovery agenda, I think is absolutely quite critical and cannot be separated. Even if we support individuals from the services that they have access to, from the institutions that protect them, from social protection issues, from broader socioeconomic issues. How do people get back to previous jobs or learn new skills to get new jobs, the ones that they have lost? How do they reintegrate into a community when you're stigmatized because of COVID, etc.? All of that, I think, generally affects the population, but affects particularly vulnerable segments of the population. Clearly, in many different cases, it's going to be women, it's going to be girls, and it's going to be, in other cases, youth with other implications. Too. So I think that's important. For the UK, it's we are a recipient organization of donors, and let me just say that our experience just over the last 3 months or 4 months has been the effort by the UK in the context of the merger as well, to pull a lot of the UN system together to ask about prevention, peace building, and the COVID context. The mission permanent mission in New York, working with London, have actually pulled us together, us, the Department for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, peacekeeping operations, Peacebuilding Support Office, other agencies, OCHA for humanitarian issues, and asked us together, what are we doing? And was not only a sort of a general global discussion, but actually taking it region by region, in many cases country by country. Afghanistan stood out, Sudan stood out, etc. And I think that's a great effort. It's a realization that, one, it is good for the UK to speak to all of the UN system together, the prevention and peacebuilding actors. And secondly, to expect a response that is coherent, complementary, because at the same time that you see us as the UN, there are departments, and the effort towards merger, I think, is important in that sense, that support our peace and development advisors separately, our climate and security programmatic issues separately, our rule of law, justice separately, our stabilization work in countries separately. And I think all of that is slowly coming together. And I think it's a much appreciated effort. So I think in that sense, we appreciate that the merger has brought a little bit of more of the complementarity. I join Julian in saying there's always room to improve on the part of our donor partners and on our part as well. And I think the key thing will end up being for all of the investment, whether it's money or people or capacity or time or energy at headquarters or at country level, I think the time has come to really think about impact as well. We're finalizing an internal evaluation now about UNDP's engagement in conflict settings. In the past 5 years, with support from donors, we spent well over $10 billion in a lot of these contexts, Yemen, Afghanistan, etc., Sudan, all of that. And we're trying to figure out where that comes now. And I think the timeliness of this discussion for the decade of action for SDGs over the next 10 years, with a focus on SDG 16, but not only, I think will be an important movement forward. Just to close, the Secretary General's report on peacebuilding and sustaining peace that came out this year in the Peacebuilding Architecture Review, there is discussion about what happens next for the next 5 years. And our plea is for member states, particular champions of peacebuilding and sustaining peace and prevention, is to really push the discussion forward so that it's not formalistic, that in a couple of years we have a report, 2 more years, 1 more report, 2025 we have another big report, but to actually help the peacebuilding actors and the development actors move the needle forward in the sphere of prevention and peacebuilding, not only because development helps peace, but because peace also helps development. Over.
Excellent, Sam. I totally agree with your last point, which, there's been some fantastic reports written about this in the past decade. What we need is implementation, not more repeated reports. We need to see real implementation here and leadership from the top on that, and the encouragement of key member states in that process as well. And very happy to try and help that from the UK here. I'm going to go back to Wangari, just steal a few minutes over the end of our hour. So please stay with us for a few more minutes. Wangari, do you want to say anything about the situation in Nigeria for women and girls as a result of lockdowns and COVID, and this issue particularly of domestic violence and teenage pregnancies and so on?
I think in the conversations we are having around this is that the COVID pandemic has also exacerbated what we are now terming the gender pandemic, because the inequalities, the access, the ability to access services, the ability to access information, the economic disempowerment has just been doubled or tripled in some cases. It's very unfortunate that the structures we have, and as someone has really mentioned, we've been really focused on humanitarian survival, making sure that women are receiving their basic needs, and we're making sure that the women are being protected. But the methodologies of doing this are so diverse and structured that we, in some cases, unfortunately, we are doing more harm. Let me give an example. We have empowered the women in the IDP camps so much. They have access, they have information, they have a collective voice. And the women in the host communities cannot have the same structures, do not have the same facilities, just because culturally they are not able to access some of the services. And we see that discrepancies being exaggerated further by the pandemic. So yes, we do have, and that's just in the Northeast. But when you look at issues around the urban settings and cities where information is available, where people are able to view or are able to access some of the services, the main issue is that we have not addressed the fundamentals of what is it to be a girl in this society? What is it to be a woman in this society? What is it that I can say yes to? What is it that I can say no to? And with such scenarios, the issues of just, we see the same scenarios of teenage pregnancies, unwanted early marriage circumstances. Of course, we recognize children, girls in the next year are going to miss out of schools because they're going to be pulled out to become economic agents, whether it's for prostitution, whether it's to offer house help work, whether it's just to be home and be caretakers. And the issue is, as said in the chat box, if we do not involve our community leaders, we do not involve our women in these discussions to actually showcase some of these examples, because the beauty is that Nigeria has amazing examples of such powerful and influential women who are doing amazing work globally, but we've not enhanced that power to trickle down to where it matters and to showcase that this actually can create the difference. So it's a long way, but I think the positivity around it is that this is a discussion on the table. You cannot be doing any programming without talking about gender, but we do need to be extra careful or extra diligent in ensuring that we're not just desegregating data and ticking the box to say we have 10,000 women, 14,000 men, but we are really talking about what is it that these women that are empowered, are these women that can make a difference, are these women really accessing the services, or are they just ticking a box? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Wangari. That again was a fascinating insight into the situation on the ground. Of course, we've just seen Nigerian women internationally become head of the World Trade Organization, and you know, there's yet another great role model for Nigerian girls. But you're absolutely right, that needs to be replicated. That opportunity needs to be replicated in local communities. I'm going to just finish on one point. In addition to thanking the speakers, Julian Egan, Christine Wilson, Sam Rizk, and Wangari Wanjau, really fantastic contributions. The chat box was full of ideas and suggestions and positive feedback, and I'm grateful to the speakers for answering or responding to points that were made in there, rather than weren't necessarily questions, but they were interesting points, and the speakers have responded to some of them. I was struck, though, I think it was Christine said in one of her comments in the chat box, be interesting to know how we could take forward this discussion and keep this discussion going. Well, I'm going to throw out there a suggestion to the British Council, to International Alert, to UNDP perhaps as well. You know, you had about 250 people signed up for this discussion. There's an appetite out there to do this better, to share experiences, and to also to positively support and encourage each other. So maybe, yes, this was a good one-off with the all-party parliamentary group, but perhaps there's a need to convene people. You know, maybe every few weeks. We've got the opportunity now. We've found new ways of communicating across the world as a result of this lockdown. We don't need to be together in conferences, very expensive conferences, to do this. We can gather in sessions like this and hear from work on the ground and hear what the leaders like Sam are doing, and influence them, but also be influenced by them. And you know, I hope perhaps that this might be a session that could be organised by the organisers to be repeated and expanded upon, and more people join in the future, and perhaps be more than just a report, an all-party group meeting, but actually an ongoing conversation. So I throw that out there as a suggestion, and thank everybody for joining us today, including our spectacular speakers. And I wish everybody, particularly those that are working hard on the ground in very difficult circumstances, I wish you all the very best for the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.